You are listening to Viewpoints from PlaceCloud. Cultural researchers tell stories of places from around the world. For the full multimedia experience and to support the creators you enjoy, visit placecloud.io.
We are at the Monte das Tabocas in the municipality of Vitória de Santo Antão in the Metropolitan Region of Recife. Here on August 3rd, 1645, the Battle of Tabocas was fought, the first armed conflict between the Portuguese and the Dutch, which culminated in the expulsion of the Dutch from Brazil in 1654. Tempers had been running high between the colonizers since Maurice de Nassau left the country's government in 1644, and this first confrontation ended with a Portuguese victory. Marching back to Recife with the defeated survivors, Dutch commander Hendrik van Huys passed through the lands of the sugar mill by the name of Casa Forte, where the wives and relatives of the Portuguese combatants were staying, and kidnapped the Portuguese women Antonia Bazera and Isabel de Gois, taking them hostage in order to gain an advantage in the conflict. When information of the kidnapping reached Portuguese leaders André Vidal de Negreiros and João Fernandes Vieira, the Portuguese-Brazilian troops marched to the site, starting another conflict with a Portuguese victory, further weakening Dutch control. The episode is mentioned in the article As Mulheres no Tempo das Flamingos, Atuação Feminina durante as Guerras Luso-Holandesas, or Women in the Time of the Flemish, Women's Spaces of Action During the Luso-Dutch War, written by historian Elisiele Falaschi, who analyzes women's experiences during the Dutch occupation of Brazil. The author argues that despite the fragmentary documentation and the dispersed presence of women in the sources, their role in the period cannot be considered invisible. Falaschi's research is based on documents including travelers' accounts, soldiers' diaries, letters, official reports, chronicles, and judicial and administrative documents from the period. Based on this analysis, she has mapped the presence of at least 90 women in the sources and seeks to reconstruct the spaces they occupied, their possibilities for action, and the degree of their direct and indirect involvement in the main events of the period. Falaschi's text identifies three main categories of occurrence of women in the documentation: as victims of specific violence, such as kidnappings and sexual violence, acting in the clashes, either directly or indirectly, and acting in different spaces of daily life affected by the war. The author uses the episode with the kidnapped women that started the Battle of Casa Forte and the stories of other female characters from the period to exemplify these categories. The author also uses as sources accounts by Maurice de Nassau himself and Friar Manuel Calado, a Portuguese cleric who lived in the country for 30 years, including during the Dutch occupation. In an account from 1638, Nassau describes the Portuguese women as less agile and elegant than the Dutch women, noting that the Portuguese women, because of their habit of sitting continuously, are not as agile as the Dutch women and walk on their platform shoes as if they have chains on their legs. In his book O Valoroso Lucidendo, The Valiant Lucidendo, written in 1648, the Portuguese Manuel Calado, on the other hand, compares French, Dutch and Spanish parties with the Portuguese, saying that the female foreigners happily drank better than the men. This narrative not only reinforces stereotypes about the supposed liberal nature of foreign women, but also suggests a moral contrast that emphasized female restraint as a Portuguese virtue. These discourses show how gender roles were used to demarcate cultural and political differences in the context of the war. Another character mentioned by the friar is Jerónima de Almeida, a Portuguese woman accused of harboring enemy troops on her property. In 1638, she was sentenced to death by the Dutch, but the intervention of elite women from Recife led Nassau to pardon her. Calado describes the moment when these women knelt at Nassau's feet, begging for clemency, demonstrating how women's collective articulation could influence political decisions. Among the foreign, that is Dutch women, Sarah Hendricks stands out. She arrived in Brazil disguised as a man to circumvent the restrictions imposed by the Dutch West India Company. Married to a preacher, Daniel Schagen, Hendricks faced accusations of immoral behavior and lived in concubinage before her marriage, and was therefore classified as a prostitute in the Portuguese-Brazilian narrative, but was only seen as a source of irritation and problems in Dutch documents. Falaschi points out that accounts such as those of Nassau and Calado often mobilized gender discourses to reinforce the moral superiority of their respective sides in the war. Nassau, for example, described the Portuguese as jealous and domineering of their women, who always keep them close, thus recognizing that the Portuguese are inclined to corrupt the women of others. Falaschi warns, however, that caution is needed when interpreting these accounts, as they are male views and constructed from the perspective of the other. Her research proposes a more in-depth analysis looking at other sources in order to draw up a more complete picture of the condition of women in the colony and avoid generalizations based on biased perceptions. Although the sources show a contrast between Dutch and Portuguese women in terms of freedom and social participation, the research recognizes the need to analyze the complexity of the female experience in the period, avoiding stereotypes and considering the nuances and diverse ways in which women acted in the context of war and colonial society. As the main sources of the research are European documents, there is little depth on the role of black and indigenous women, and Falaschi herself recognizes the need to deepen research into these women, whose stories often remain on the margins of traditional narratives. However, there are mentions in the text of the participation of a particular black woman described as Negra Criolla and Fora in the Battle of Casa Forte in 1645. She is portrayed by Friar Manuel Calado as having killed a Dutch soldier with a staff, demonstrating courage and resistance to the violence of war. The text mentions the participation of indigenous women in the fighting, with the Portuguese friar emphasizing that they actually go to war. This statement suggests that female participation in conflicts was a common practice in some indigenous cultures, challenging the Eurocentric view that associates war exclusively with the male universe.